Welcome back, everyone. Today we are joined by the YouTube channel Perun. On YouTube, he just crossed 300,000 subscribers. If you've been following the war in Ukraine, hopefully you have already seen his content. He makes in-depth, hour-long PowerPoint presentations about various aspects of the global defense industry, but specifically the war in Ukraine. Perun, thank you so much. Welcome to the channel.
Oh, very good to be here, Jake.
So my first question is the obvious one. I think a lot of people are rightfully curious about your backgrounds, but you have a desire for anonymity or privacy. In your own words, can you describe for the audience why that is?
Well, are they particularly interested? In many ways, I think I'm the least interesting part of this story. We're watching a major international event happen in real time. And I know we all have our own styles, but my view has always been that I'm not the story. The work should stand on its own. We've got literally millions of people who I hope write books or have their stories told after all is said and done. And I kind of want the focus to be on them, not me. And this style is working for me in that respect.
So with your channel, going back to February, this seemed like a hobby channel in which you were talking about a video game, Terra Invicta. Is that the name of the game?
Oh, back then it was even more niche. It was Dominions 5, which is an incredibly niche strategy title that I was playing in my spare time.
And I want to ask, what was your motivation for making that first video talking about the war in Ukraine?
Well, so what happened is the invasion takes place 24th February, and it's clear immediately that this is a world-changing event. It's emotionally significant, I think, for a lot of people understanding when you're seeing history written in real time. Australia doesn't have anywhere near the same Ukrainian population that, for example, Canada does, but a lot of its migration waves were from countries who, well, for America, independence is something that happened in the 18th century, but for a lot of Eastern and Southern Europe, independence is a creature of the 1990s, right? And to see war come back to these sort of territories after a number of decades, it was quite raw. So I was completely glued to the coverage. And then I had an "oh no, someone is wrong on the internet" moment. I'm not sure if you remember what the coverage was like back in that first week in February, but the overwhelming narrative you saw everywhere was Ukraine is completely outmatched. And the statistics that were being flashed up, I saw these infographics on certain major networks that were saying Russia has 12,000 tanks, Russia has 1 million men. You know, this is a complete David and Goliath fight. Ukraine can't possibly win. At the exact moment where governments and people needed to understood that there was a potential for Ukraine to defend itself, otherwise there would be no incentive to assist in that critical moment. And I knew that those figures were, to not too fine a point on it, were completely wrong. Like the 12,000 tank figure includes stuff that's in the boneyard that is completely unserviceable. The 1 million person figure they were using was fanciful. It includes aerospace forces and naval forces, people who could never be deployed to Ukraine. The state defense order, the Russian state defense order, which I was relatively familiar with, I knew there just wasn't the budget for the sort of mismatch that people were describing this as. So it was, in my view, a much closer fight than people were suggesting it would be, and there was an opportunity for it to go either way depending on what the international response was. So I was very fired up. Normally you don't get too, I suppose, emotionally charged when someone is wrong on the internet, but in this case it was a major event in real time. So I hacked together, I think it was on day 4, I hacked together a PowerPoint out of what I knew about the Russian SDO, their reserve system, their equipment statistics, and what was available and what might happen, that I think met with and agreed with what we were seeing happen in real time, and I just fired that out. There was basically no editing. I think I recorded it in like an hour-long straight run. I paused it a couple of times to get a drink of water, and that was about it. So it was the lowest production value thing I have ever done. I just put together a PowerPoint presentation, had no idea where to put it. I had a gaming channel, which meant I'd gone through the registration process for YouTube, and I'm like, you know what, that'll do. That'll do. I've now said my piece. I've yelled into the void with a PowerPoint on this topic, and it went nowhere for a couple of days, and then apparently the YouTube algorithm decided this is what people want to see, and it took off from there. But that was essentially it. It was a creature of frustration with the coverage I was seeing, desperately wanting to, I suppose, influence in some tiny way that conversation.
So you said it didn't go anywhere. Obviously, for the first couple days, maybe your normal audience didn't understand why you uploaded it. How many views did that first video end up getting?
I think it's at about 1.7 million last time I checked, um, which is a bit of an escalation for a channel that was previously had a very dedicated audience of maybe 2,000, 3,000. Like I said, Dominions is a pretty niche title, and it was mostly uploaded for the benefit of the others that I was like playing competitively against. This was a very different audience that it took on with, and it was extremely surreal to see that take off as it did. And that's what inspired the follow-on videos, because at that point I realized maybe there is an audience. So if there is anything that I can say where I am confident I can say something that might be of value, and I can say it with a degree of confidence, then I may as well take advantage of the audience while it is here.
Yeah, it's incredible when people have those viral moments. You don't 100% understand why your video or your content just keeps getting recommended and keeps snowballing. But I imagine, with YouTube especially, the algorithm rewards people who share content. When you share on Twitter or share on Reddit or share on Facebook, the algorithm knows that there's something of value here, and it just perpetuates that way. So I'm glad that you were discovered by the algorithm, and that you've been able to share your knowledge base with the wider world for these last 9 or 10 months.
But I think you'd have to agree, if you had told us in January that good content on YouTube would constitute hour-long, PowerPoint presentations on the defense industrial base or defense economics and logistics, you probably would have laughed. So it is all a little bit surreal, to be frank.
I've studied how to be a successful YouTuber, because that's what I do professionally now. And the way it was described to me, there's like a triangle, and you've got to be good at least two of the three things. You have to have an amazing personality. People just find you infectious. Two, you have to have really good editing. Your editing is top notch. Or three, you have the best information. You just provide people with good value. So I applaud you, because both of our channels,
It's not my editing.
we don't do a lot of editing, no. And as far as personality, you do have some good zingers and jokes in there occasionally, but for you, I think it's just the top quality, specific knowledge base that you have, providing people that has drawn such a large audience concerning this conflict.
And I'm greatly thankful. I know we need to move on, but I'll make the last comment there that I'm really thankful that I have not had to go over to using difficult animations or zinging editing, because it means so much of the production time. And I have a very limited window of production time available. I already expense a lot of my sleep towards this as it is. That more of it can go into research and correspondence, gathering, processing, corroboration, and then production, as opposed to just zinging up the presentation. So I'm really appreciative that the audience has been tolerant of that.
I can also tell that you're making the content you want to make, and you're not chasing the algorithm. You're not doing normally what other YouTubers do in order to have success on this platform. So concerning one of your recent videos in which you talked about the impact that winter is going to have on the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces, at first it sounded like the narrative was going to be there's going to be this huge slowdown in the fighting on the front lines because of the cold. But now I feel like, at least the articles and news stories I've been seeing, it's shifted 180. And you made the argument that you don't think that the fighting is going to slow down at all this winter. Can you explain your rationale, why you think there isn't going to be a significant pause in the conflict?
Yeah, and I was very confused by the slowdown narrative in the first place. The first point to say is to slow down compared to what? Because the winter actually is an improvement in terms of operational mobility over the mud season that leads into winter. If you've seen some of the videos of MTLBs and armoured vehicles basically drowning in the mud season is a greater inhibitor to operations than the frozen ground of winter. Also, historically, this part of the world, winter offensives are what the Soviet army did in Ukraine and parts of Western Russia. So there's historical precedent for it, and it's not like the Ukrainians don't know how to fight in the winter. When we say the Soviets fought in Ukraine in the winter, well, the Ukrainians were a significant part of the Soviet army in that era. And that culture, the adaptation of equipment, all that continues. But I think the biggest thing that got me was from a strategic perspective, there was no motivation. There's no motivation to slow down the fighting. If you think about the balance of initiative, one side is always going to feel like they have the initiative, and the other side is always going to want to regenerate and eventually reclaim it. At the moment, I would argue Ukraine has the initiative and desperately doesn't want Russia to have time to reconstitute and regenerate. So the worst possible thing for the Ukrainians to do would be to sit back and let the Russians regenerate over winter and launch their own spring offensive, for example. Russia started mobilization late. It has a backlog and limitations in its training pipeline. It's desperately trying to reconstitute equipment out of reserve. A couple of months of break would be exactly what the doctor ordered for the Russian army. So it makes sense that the Ukrainians would want to roll on with the momentum they had, especially when winter gave them the advantage of better mobility, particularly in the south.
Interesting. Yeah, I think we're going to know relatively soon whether or not there will be a big counteroffensive. Perhaps, once again, it's all speculation, but they are just maybe pausing for the holidays. But maybe something is coming in January when the ground is more thoroughly frozen, I guess. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting. We've seen statements on that point. So both sides have telegraphed intentions to an extent. So the Ukrainians have telegraphed the fact so Reznikov has telegraphed the fact that they're waiting for the ground to harden so that they can launch their next operation, whether that is in the north or in the south or both at the same time. So whether they try and produce the Kharkiv-Kherson dilemma all over again, who knows? But the Ukrainians are also saying, Zaluzhny said in a recent interview that they're concerned about Russia making a new push on Kyiv, potentially out of Belarus again in February or March. Now, is that their genuine belief? Is that disinformation? Who knows? But there's a lot of telegraphing about intentions, basically saying, as soon as the conditions are better, as soon as the ground is not a sea of mud, then you're likely to see an increase in operational tempo again.
The other aspect of the war happening this winter is Russia's continued attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The question I have for you is, can you think of a justification? Because I personally don't, but do you believe that the benefits that Russia can get from going after Ukraine's energy infrastructure is worth the cost they're expending drawing down their existing stockpile of long-range precision munitions?
Okay, so this is an interesting question, and I tried to tackle this recently, and I'll try to be more compact than an hour in addressing it. Unfortunately, the answer is a very unsatisfying "it depends" as far as I'm concerned, for a couple of reasons. So, launching this sort of campaign, traditionally speaking, a strategic bombing campaign on civilian infrastructure, you're trying to achieve probably three things in parallel. You're damaging industrial production, you're damaging military capacity, and you're undermining civilian morale. I think the Russians have a fourth case here, which is bolstering domestic morale, which is that there are ultra-nationalists back home or those who want to see activity, who are critical of withdrawals, the so-called repositioning in Kharkiv or Kherson, who want to see something being done, and strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure sort of steady that constituency. So that's sort of the fourth side benefit. Is that worth firing off hundreds of precision-guided munitions that you can't replace at anywhere near the usage rate? Probably not on its own. Damage to industrial production? That's sort of secondary because most of Ukraine's war industry isn't in Ukraine. Most of Ukrainian resupply is coming from European nations, the United States, or Ukraine's various allies around the world, and the Russians are not going to launch missiles at Lockheed Martin facilities to try and knock out Gimler's production or something like that. The damage to military capacity is where you have the question around it depends. So, for example, it does slow down Ukrainian train travel when the power grid goes down because most Ukrainian trains that are moving military units, those are electrically powered. But the Ukrainians are pretty good at prioritizing backup diesel locomotives to supply their forces or to prioritize certain times where the grid will supply the rail network and will keep supplies running. Still, significant problem. The big issue here is the depletion of Ukrainian air defense systems. The Ukrainians started the war with thousands of S-300 and Buk missiles, but there's a limit. And every time Russia fires calibers or old car series missiles or Shahed drones, and they have to be intercepted with Ukrainian ground-based air defense, that's one less missile that Ukraine has in its arsenal. Often it's two less missiles because the Ukrainians, if it's an important target, they'll ripple fire. They'll fire two SAMs against one incoming, if it's like a caliber going for a critical target. So the question becomes, can the Russians deplete Ukrainian air defense enough that they have to pull SAMs off the front to defend critical infrastructure, and then the Russians can start using their air power more at the front, which would be a very significant problem in a lot of ways. So here comes the it depends point. If Western powers see Ukrainian infrastructure being bombed, they see Ukrainian civilians suffering, they see cities plunged into darkness, operations being done in the darkness, and the result is they start supplying more ground-based air defense to Ukraine, then the whole operation's a wash. Because if the Russians are trying to drain Ukrainian air defenses and that results in the West sending more air defenses because they're outraged by the offensive, then the whole offensive is a wash. If there is no resupply, maybe you can make some sort of tangential argument that this is a militarily effective program. I think it's damaging. I think it's highly damaging to the Ukrainians. But at the same time, very limited. This is a very limited weapon set and a very capable weapon set that the Russians are using. So we've heard talk about Patriot. We've heard talk about NASAMS, Krotal, and a number of other systems that are going into Ukraine. I'm going to harp on resupply all the time. If the response to these bombings is that everyone sends more air defense, then the campaign has probably backfired in a big way. And if everyone just leaves it be, well, then we'll see how it goes.
I do think at some point this winter the Russians are going to realize, the West will just keep resupplying or providing new air defense systems, and as you said, it backfired, the desired effect. Do you think on the ground at this time the Ukrainian forces are winning the battle? And was there a turning point for you if you believe so?
So I don't want to overstate my expertise, and I'll put a big asterisk here saying this is just personal opinion. I'm also going to say I really appreciate the question, but I also hate this question in a way, because the problem with the who is winning conversation is that person A can say Ukraine is winning because X, and person B can come up and say, but Russia is winning because, and then they make up some new war goal for Russia. So for example, if you assume Russia's war goal was regime change in Ukraine, then Russia has probably already lost. In fact, they have almost certainly already lost, because it's very hard to imagine a situation where they actually take Kyiv, capture Zelensky, overthrow the government. That horse has bolted, that's done. But you will encounter arguments that basically say, oh, no, Russia's goal is just to take a couple of villages in the Donbass. Or Russia's goal is, if they take Bakhmut, they're winning. So because the term doesn't mean anything specifically, it's hard to prove because people will always change what they mean by the term winning. I'll say this in terms of how I think it's going. I believe the initial Russian objective was a regime change operation. They built their operation like they were trying to do regime. This thunder run to Kyiv, special forces groups in the city itself, Putin's call to the military to rise up and overthrow Zelensky so he can negotiate with them. There's a lot about the initial Russian operation that screams regime change attempt. They're trying to do what the United States does. Quick movement against the center of enemy power, overthrow the government, war done, shock and awe. That clearly failed. The revised Russian goal was a land grab. So they've claimed to have annexed Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. That is you can probably say that's failed in most respects. Kherson the city has been taken. It's very hard to imagine a universe in which Russia, in the near future, recrosses the Dnipro, takes it, and then says this land all belongs to us now. And the idea of claiming you own a piece of land when the defending nation has retaken it is a bit fanciful. If the goal was to improve Russian security and hold back NATO, I'd argue that's failed dramatically. Sweden and Finland coming into NATO is a massive, massive thing. I think that will be approved by the Turks in 2023. I think it will happen. And even in a scenario where it didn't happen, the relationship between those two powers in NATO now is so close as a result of this that they're basically inseparable regardless, even if they don't benefit from all the organizational structures of NATO. if the goal was to improve Russian security relative to the West, I think that's a complete disaster. There were these huge stockpiles of military capacity represented by those tanks in boneyards, those deep reserves of ammunition, all of this inheritance from the Soviet Union. At the same time as European powers were really enjoying their peace dividend. Like, they had really enjoyed cutting those defense budgets back basically as far as they would go. That's all gone now, or it's in the process of being eroded. So much accumulated military capital in Russia is being destroyed. So many experienced personnel are being lost at the same time as budgets in the West are going up. Even just the US appropriations that just went through then, terrifying numbers from a Russian perspective in terms of what the Americans are putting into, but also what the Germans and the French and the Italians and the British and the Poles in particular, like all of these increases of investment speak to an increasing capability in NATO that Russia cannot match. So in many senses, by poking Europe and NATO, they're undermining their own security balance dramatically. So it's hard to construct a version of Russian objectives where you can't say this war hasn't been disastrous. The final thing I'll say is most people, when they use the term winning, I think refer to who is gaining ground on the ground right now, who has the initiative. I think the initiative still sits with the Ukrainians. They're attacking on one front. They've recently finished attacking on another front. They're probably preparing to attack on a third front. And they're defending on a fourth. They're defending around Bakhmut in Donetsk. So the initiative probably sits with the Ukrainians, and most Russian sources, most of the more realistic Russian commentators are pessimistic on that fact and point to the need to reconstitute and prepare something for the new year. So Ukraine is paying a very high price in terms of casualties, in terms of the suffering of the people, in terms of economic output. I've heard estimates that half of Ukrainian GDP is probably now directed towards the war effort, which is mind-blowing. That's sort of where certain powers were during the Second World War. Certainly never the United States was that far. So it's expensive in lives and material. But I would say Ukraine currently has the advantage. So far as the turning point, this is something historians will debate forever, and they will write dueling theses at each other to try and establish what the turning point was, and it'll provide fantastic content and debate for generations. I would argue when regime change failed, that this was already off the rails. So when the thrust at Kyiv didn't work, then this operation was already off the rails. So you can build a turning point out of three things. Zelensky and the government didn't run, the city of Kyiv didn't fall, and the West agreed to resupply Ukraine on a far more lavish scale than the Russians probably expected. Because if you can't win this war quickly by toppling the Ukrainian government, then you have to fight it slowly. And a slow war is incompatible with the most grandiose Russian objectives. So that's probably a very long-winded way of answering your question. But it's my attempt to get around the usual he said, she said of what winning is. Feel free to follow up if you think I've dodged the question in any respect.
Well, I asked you a question that I already have an answer to myself. I just wanted to hear what you would say. But for me, the turning point had to have been the introduction of these HIMARS launchers, I think at the beginning of July. You're right. Russia gave up on Kyiv. They pulled out of the north, I think in April. And the war changed at that point. It no longer was about regime change. It was about getting the land bridge to Crimea and the Donbass region. And Russia was still advancing, taking the cities of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. I think this was the end of June, early July, and that's when the first 4 HIMARS launchers showed up. So my next question for you is, how is it possible that Russia cannot locate and destroy these HIMARS launchers? How did HIMARS become this unsolvable problem for the Russian military?
But Jake, don't you listen to General Konashenkov's daily briefings? They've destroyed all the HIMARS systems, Jake. They've destroyed more than all.
68 of 24 have been destroyed.
They destroyed one on the second floor of an apartment building. It was an amazing shot. Okay, so this is an interesting question, and I like to lean on what some of not the Russian government, but some pro-Russian sources say, because it's interesting to get the perspective of the people who are on the receiving end. there is a spectrum of the story of how much of a problem HIMARS is on that Russian side. Obviously, MOD claims they've destroyed them all. The bloggers, even the people associated with Wagner, think that's crazy. They think they might have gotten 2 or 3. I think the Wagner says maybe we've hit 2, and that these are a significant threat, and that air defense maybe intercepts half of the incoming Gimler's rockets. But even that, and that's the pro-Russian claim, and even that's a problem for them because they're using Buk as the primary counter, where 2 Buk missiles is much harder to replace than 1 Gimler's, especially if with the production ramps that are now happening. But let's assume it's somewhere between 0 and 2. The Ukrainian and the American position is 0. I tend to believe 0, but let's assume it's 0 to 2. The Russian problem, as they has identified it with HIMARS, is in the high part of the problem, and the M is also relevant there. So high mobility artillery rocket system. This is an extremely mobile system. It's road-based, moves quickly, so the Ukrainian crews roll it to a firing position. They have a pre-planned target. They fire the 6-pack of rockets. Maybe they reload in place, which is very rapid with HIMARS, but most of the time they're going to fire the 6-pack and they're going to bolt. They're going to move. So the rockets are in the air and the launcher is already mobile. And the problem that the Russians have is it's very difficult to form a kill chain on a moving target that far behind the line. So they need to find the launcher first. In a best-case scenario, if the Russians have air defense in the area, maybe they get a rough directional fix when those Gimler's rockets get fired. Maybe. But they need a precision fix in order to engage it, which means finding it. Realistically, the Russians say they need to find it with a drone. So you need a drone in the rough area behind Ukrainian lines that can see the system shortly after launch, gets you a location. Great. You now have a HIMARS in a rough location, but now you need to task a weapon system to engage that target, and you need to be able to track it while it moves. And it's moving at the speed of a truck on a road. And there are limited options for the Russian military in terms of their weapon systems to engage a target at distance while it is moving, because for no other reason than communication between the people operating the drone and the people who control like a caliber system or something with serious range to it, that communication is not quick or easy. It's often bureaucratic. They're changing, they're adapting their speed so that they can task fire more quickly, but it's still slow. So someone might see an American-built HIMARS system, but it might take them 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 4 hours to get onto someone who can task a weapon system to engage it. And even if they do engage it, as soon as it starts moving, there's basically no weapon systems available to them that can engage a target like that at distance. They have things like the Lancet, the loitering munition, which can engage a moving target as long as the drone is tracking, but it's got a 40-kilometer range. HIMARS is well beyond that after it's fired its pack and it's moving. So the Ukrainians have been very good, as far as the Russians are concerned, at moving in, firing, moving again, most of the time evading detection, and if they are detected, getting out of reach or breaking a track before the Russians can successfully engage it. Which is why they beg for more drones. They beg for better communications. They beg for long-range precision weapons so they can deal with this threat. And I agree with you. I do think, I think Kyiv was an absolutely decisive moment, but you will remember the introduction of HIMARS and watching the Telegram channels that are associated with some of these Russian units, these DPR, LPR units, or associated with the Russian military, after ammunition dump after ammunition dump after ammunition dump just started sparking off. There was a degree of fear about it. And the best solution that the Russian channels now talk about or advocate is we can't find the launchers. Try and find where they're keeping the rockets. Try and find the Ukrainian warehouses where they're stashing the Gimlers for the reloads, and maybe try and hit those with long-distance munitions. That's the best solution they've come up with so far. It's apparently quite difficult for them to make work. Ukrainians are very good at hiding them, and they store them in relatively small numbers.
Yeah, you could just space them out.
And then you end up tasking a cruise missile to engage like 12 Gimlers in a warehouse, which is not a particularly efficient use of material. So it's a relatively simple system on the face of it. But there is a reason it causes problems, and it's because its mobility and its range exploits a weakness in Russian ISR, basically.
So for the rest of this war, Russia is just going to have to tolerate this they can't have an ammo depot within 80 kilometers of the front lines for fear that the Ukrainians are going to HIMARS it? They're just not going to solve this problem?
Well, they've done a couple of things, but all of them come with costs. So eventually we stopped seeing those big ammunition dump explosions twice a day, like we were at the peak. The first thing they did is, as you say, they pushed the ammunition dumps back to get them out of HIMARS range. The second thing they did was they dispersed them. So instead of piling up huge dumps, you have small unit-level dumps that may or may not be worth engaging with a Gimler's round, which is why those end up getting targeted by like drones dropping 40 mils instead. But all that comes with a logistical cost. The Russian army is not palletized. They don't use forklifts. They're carrying boxes with individually packed 152 and 122 shells. So the more distance you can get, the further back you can push those ammunition depots, the more you inhibit their operations. And there was recently an interview with quite a well-known Ukrainian artillery commander who points this out, that the artillery now from the Russians is bad at places like Bakhmut, but it is nothing like what it was at places like Popasna. So the reason Severodonetsk and Lysychansk fall is because there's that breakthrough at Popasna, and that lets the Russians get behind Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And at Popasna, there was an insane wall of fire from artillery. That's where you get the 40, 50, 60,000 rounds per day number. That's not logistically possible in a universe where you have to disperse your ammo the way they now have to. So either they find a way to destroy the systems, or they run them out of rockets, or they find a way to improve their air defense. But if you improve your air defense, protecting every ammunition depot is difficult. So it's a difficult problem. The solution on paper in Russian doctrine is attack helicopters. The Kar-52s are meant to go hunt those sort of systems, but they can't. There's too much ground-based air defense. You can't fly high because the Ukrainian airspace is dominated by the old Soviet systems and now NASAMS and IRIS-T. You can't fly low because every man and his dog in Ukraine now has a Stinger or an Igla or a Strela or everything else that people found in the warehouses of Eastern Europe or American arsenals. So the helicopters can't go deep into Ukrainian territory hunting for these systems the way, for example, your Apaches might have during Iraq 1, where you would have gone hunting Scuds with helicopters. They can't do it with the Kar-52s. They tried in the opening days. They can't do it. So not that I would give the Russian army advice if I had it, but no, I don't think that there is an immediate solution on paper to solving the problem of HIMARS. And if, I know I've rambled on, so I'll close out on this point, if this talk of ground-launched small-diameter bomb, so this joint program that Saab has come up with to launch basically a guided small-diameter bomb with a rocket booster out of HIMARS with a 150k range, if that surfaces for the spring offensive next year, then the Russians have a serious problem, because now the ammo dumps can't be within 80 kilometers. They now can't be within 150 kilometers.
Yeah.
And it's a cheap, and unlike ATACMS, which is very expensive, GLSDB is a cheap system.
Yeah.
So it's worth engaging ammo depots. So that's a logistical nightmare. Having to push your ammo 150 Ks back, well, less than that, because you need to account for the fact that the system's not parked on the contact line. Like the HIMARS isn't in the frontline trench.
Yeah.
But that would be a huge logistical problem if these longer range systems start arriving, which I imagine is why Ukraine begs for long range missiles all the time, so they can break the back of Russian logistics.
I think it's coming. I think the solution that you just mentioned, the cheaper solution to go 150, is probably coming soon. Next problem for the Russian military, you made a fantastic video about the Russian word vranyo, which stands for deception or embellishment in Russian society, so that life is just easier for everyone. The closest equivalent I think we would have in America would be telling white lies, but in the United States military, I would never tell a white lie about combat readiness or the existence of weapon stockpiles, but apparently in the Russian military, in Russian society, they do this. So when I watched that video, I wanted to ask you, does Ukraine have a similar history of this culture of vranyo, given that they were both members of the Soviet Union? Is something similar existing today in Ukraine, or did they have to break this in order to successfully fight this war?
It's an interesting question. And when I was doing that video, I gave a lot of thought as to how I would label it. So I used vranyo because vranyo can sometimes have that implication. It's used different ways by different people. It often speaks to that phenomenon. Another one that might be used is, let's see if I can remember, Ochkov Tiralitstvo, I think. Depends how it's conjugated. So there's multiple words in Russian you could apply to this phenomenon. Is this also a problem in Ukraine historically? Absolutely. Absolutely. Has this been a problem in Ukraine historically? And corruption. Ukraine historically has massive corruption problems. One of the reasons the Ukrainian army was so weak in 2014 was systemic corruption, underfunding, those difficulties the system faced. Have they pulled it together in relation to the war? To a great extent, yes. This is the thing. And I wonder if one of the problems of Russian calculus was assuming that there had been no cultural or organizational change between 2014 and 2022. But is this still a problem in the Ukrainian military, like corruption, incompetence, misreporting? It absolutely still happens, and you see complaints. They will admit that they have good commanders, they have bad commanders. They have commanders who embody the best of what you would think of as the Western style of warfighting. Truth to power, personal initiative, responsibility for the troops, mission command. And they have those that are not so good. The important point has been to replace those who embody those old ways of thinking. I think Russian misinformation has focused on this a lot as a point of vulnerability, particularly around trying to argue that in relation to weapon supply, like trying to convince the West that all of the weapons are being stolen and diverted and ending up in the hands of enemy powers or whatnot. That's overstated. There were some serious problems in the EU Foreign Legion, particularly in its early days. But in relation to heavy weapon systems and the front now, there's a monitoring mission in place. So I think Ukraine has its historical issues. I think it's still going to be fighting those issues after the war is over, but it's come leaps and bounds. And the difference is that the Ukrainians don't have to be perfect. They just have to be better than the Russians. And the other point is that the defensive war setting, I think, provides a little bit of an imperative to sort of rally around the flag a little bit and respect the truth a little bit more if that gets stuff done. And there's been more crackdowns on corruption, deception, etc., than there would be in a peacetime setting. But I think it's fanciful to say it's all fixed. I don't think any Ukrainian would argue that their army is perfect. It still has issues, but it's improved dramatically. But this is a legacy of the Soviet Union, and you will hear people who lived in any of the Warsaw Pact states talk about their experience of this sort of phenomenon and how it arose in those years.
We pretend to work, they pretend to pay us.
Basically, and all the little lies that keep the system working.
I imagine
until it's tested, then it doesn't work.
I imagine in peacetime, it's about how cunning can you be if you want to, engage in corruption. But you're right. When the war breaks out and people start dying, there's no wiggle room anymore. You can't. You either have to be able to do the job or you can't do the job, and you're going to be quickly replaced.
Indeed.
So do you think for the Russians, they can break this tradition of vranyo? Do you think while they're fighting a war, and this is currently happening, an offensive war, can the commanders on the front lines, from the lowest troop to the general calling all the shots, are they capable of breaking this tradition of embellishment or outright lying while Putin is still in charge?
It's an interesting point. They're trying. They're trying. How successful it will be remains to be seen. There's been a lot of commanders replaced. A lot of the practices that were at the heart of the worst examples of this were things like video reports, wherein if I'm running a unit, the way I would pretend everything is fine is, instead of having an exercise where everyone does shooting practice, I just photograph everyone at the shooting range and include that with my report. But in reality, no one shoots. So there's some efforts to stamp out some of this, but it's so pervasive, so endemic that it would be a real cultural challenge in the best of times, and they don't have the additional motivation that comes with the self-preservation and survival. And there are still perverse incentives to be deceptive. If you want to get promoted, or you want the best position, or you want to be well regarded. I don't know how successful they have. Like, I couldn't put on a scale of 1 to 10 how successful they have been in clamping down on this phenomenon. There are optimists and there are pessimists on the Russian side of the line. Some of the most incompetent Russian commanders are gone. Surovikin has been pretty ruthless in who he recommends gets kicked out. And the fact they withdrew from Kherson at all means that someone told Putin they couldn't hold it, which is an improvement from before. But they're starting from a very low bar. So they're starting from a very low bar. So the extent to which they're able to achieve that sort of organizational change, I don't know. Certainly as long as Putin is in charge, there is always going to be a motivation to tell the autocrat what he wants to hear. Like, always. In every autocratic society ever, there is a motivation to be the person telling the autocrat what he wants to hear. He is more likely to believe you than the person telling him what he doesn't want to hear. Congratulations, you now have the job that used to be the job of the person who's telling him what he doesn't want to hear. Like, that is a tale as old as time. So I can't give you a definitive answer. I'm not a Kremlin watcher. The Russian side still complains about this as a pervasive problem. Some of them say they might be making improvements, just like they're trying to solve like alcohol abuse and ill discipline at the front. Wartime's probably a bad time to be trying to solve those sort of problems. And the introduction of large numbers of like reservist officers and mobilized personnel who don't want to be there, again, probably not a great help in this regard, but we'll see.
Have you ever seen the HBO mini documentary series Chernobyl?
I have.
I have. When you were describing Vranyo, I couldn't help but think of those the Chernobyl power plant directors. How they probably knew everything was going wrong, but they were denying it the whole time. And then when it all blew up and Moscow leadership came to the city, they said, "All right, we have a list of people that we think can be held responsible." Like, they did everything wrong, and then as soon as higher ups were notified, they tried to save themselves by coming up with subordinates to blame. When I think
eventually I want to close out that series. The corruption destroys armies, lies destroy armies. I want to close that out eventually with how politics destroys armies, because that's sort of the third natural part of the trilogy, which is starting to touch on there, how power games, scapegoating, those sort of dimensions, and the importance of scapegoating and playing for political position undermines military effectiveness.
For sure. So my next question is, going into 2023, what do you think are going to be the biggest challenges for the Ukrainian military?
I think for the Ukrainian in a military sense, there's probably four. One is aerospace defense, making sure they can sustain their ground-based air defense systems, maybe introduce an airborne platform, so maybe be able to contest the skies with a fourth-gen fighter from overseas. That's probably like the shortest range issue. Ammunition supply, I think the problem here is overstated. I think it's less an industrial problem than a political mobilization problem, but I'm not sure how much you want to get into that, but that's definitely a medium-term challenge. I think that offensive potential, it's been said by a number of commentators, and I agree, the extent to which either side's able to go on the offensive in 2023 is going to owe a lot to munition supply. It's how many shells and how many PGMs are coming in. So how many small diameter bombs with guidance kits, how many JDAMs we're hearing now coming in, how many precision guided kits for 155, because those are all much more valuable than an individual dumb shell. Heavy equipment resupply is a big one because there's still no answer on the table. There's lots of potential answers. Like, there's a lot of people who might give them tanks. There's a lot of people who might give them IFEs. There's thousands of them sitting in different people's storages around the world, but there's been no concrete decision to actually supply and sustain them. And eventually the Soviet-era kit is going to run out. They can't rely on the Russians leaving large stocks of equipment behind every time they retreat from an area, which is a significant part of what has allowed the Ukrainian army to do what it's done. It's that the Russians, especially around Kyiv and later Kharkiv left so much equipment behind that was able to be repaired, salvaged, and put back into service. So that heavy equipment problem needs to be solved. And the final point is a training pipeline. The Russians have a limitation in their training pipeline. They've paused mobilization at the moment. I half suspect it's not because they don't need more people. It's because they're busy processing the conscript intake, which they do twice a year. And that sometime in the new year, once they're finished processing the conscript intake and the training ranges are free, there's probably going to be more mobilized personnel coming through. Ukraine's got a training gate problem as well, and outsourcing that has been critical. Like the value of getting an additional 10,000 personnel who've gone through British infantry training, even if it's only 8 weeks. Not much, but by the standard of what's happening in Ukraine, that's a huge advantage. So seeing Western powers ramp up a training pipeline wherein Ukrainians get trained on European or American or British bases, critically important. Those are the military challenges. I think the big challenge down the bottom, and I might, depending on how this goes, I might try and throw this one back to you later on, is the big question mark is always Western support. This war goes one way if Western support holds. It goes another way if Western support doesn't hold. And that's an unfortunate problem for an army that feels like it's fighting for national survival, because it can fight as hard as it wants, but the difference between victory and defeat is ultimately a decision made in a foreign capital. So that's not so much a military challenge, it's a grand strategic challenge. How does Ukraine keep the supplies flowing? I'll close out there by saying, in a recent interview, that Ukrainian artillery officer, who's quite cynical in most respects, did say, basically, if America provided us with enough Gimlers, we'd go to Vladivostok if that's what it took. Like, there's nothing to stop us as long as the munitions keep going. But the munitions will always be a limiting factor because modern war consumes so much of them. And there is no way for the Ukrainian industry to meet that requirement.
Yeah, I know they're starting to put stuff on ships, but I feel like the limitation in the early months was how fast can the United States fly this stuff from the East Coast to Poland, and then it has to be dragged or driven across the border. To me, that I feel like is the limitation. Yes, eventually the United States would run out of Gimlers. I looked at the numbers of what the existing stockpile was, and they're making more, but I think the Ukrainians are probably using them faster than the United States can produce them.
I think everything is being used by everyone faster that can be produced. No one is in a production stable environment. Maybe you can get a production stable environment for 155mm, but I will not do a 30-minute soliloquy on how you mobilize Western industrial potential in the Allied States in order to furnish artillery ammo. I'll save that for a video.
That probably makes sense. The next hot button topic that is in the news is Ukraine participating in peace talks. If we go back in time 2 months ago, Zelensky told the Russians, if you annex these 4 territories, we're not going to participate in any more peace talks as long as Putin's in power. That was, I think, before they took Kherson, but after the Kharkiv counteroffensive. So my question to you is, do you have an opinion on whether or not the Ukrainians should at least be talking, having Ukrainian diplomats talking to Russian diplomats in regular negotiations to work through or find some kind of end to the conflict?
I'm going to be very careful here. The question of peace talks, that's ultimately a political question. So it's up to the Ukrainians when they should engage with the Russians. I will say that from a perspective, so I've trained people in negotiation before. I would be very pessimistic about the prospect of a negotiation right now, because normally in a negotiation, you have to start reasonably close together in order to get a deal. And if you aren't reasonably close together, well, then the next strategy is to expand the chessboard, bring in more issues, and make a grand bargain over something bigger until you can get a deal. There's night and day between the two sides at the moment, because the Russian claim now, they've dug in around the idea that 4 oblasts of Ukraine belong to Russia. So 4 provinces of internationally recognized Ukraine are Russian. And they want a bunch of additional things beyond that. But they've said, we want these 4 territories. The Ukrainians have said that they're not going to give up any of those territories, and they're in fact going to reclaim the ones that they have lost since 2014. There is no middle ground there. And the Ukrainians, I think, are likely to be suspicious, because if you pause for negotiations, that's what Russia wants. Russia wants a ceasefire. Maybe they argue, hey, Western powers, to lower the tensions during these peace talks, just reduce the weapons shipments a little bit. Right now, just to show we're negotiating, damp down the sense of urgency, buy some time. Oh no, the talks fell through, we attack. The final thing I'll say there is, I love polling data. And polling data on this point is very interesting, because it tells me people want to have their cake and eat it too. Because when you poll a lot of international populations, a lot of time these countries, the populations say they want peace talks. They want peace now. We should have a peace deal. But you ask them, should Ukraine give up territory for peace? And they'll say no. And my response to that would be, well, that's not an option that is currently on the table. You don't get to pick that option, because Russia is not offering any peace deal in which Ukraine doesn't give up its territory. And even countries that are aligned with the Russians in the popular narrative, I think it's more complicated than that, but the Chinese, for example, do not recognize the annexation of Crimea, let alone the annexation of Donetsk and Luhansk and Kherson and Zaporizhia. So international support for a peace deal of the kind that Russia is willing to accept, I don't see it. I don't see it in Ukraine. I think the Ukrainian government would fall if it seriously considered a deal where they evacuated Kherson that they have just reclaimed and gave it back to the Russians. I think the Ukrainian government would fall. So I don't see it. I don't see how you get a peace deal. And in that environment, it's probably more important, the Ukrainians believe, to keep up the pressure, improve their military situation, and come back when the two sides are closer.
Yep, everything you said makes sense. And I feel like the arguments I've heard is that when you engage in negotiations, you at least are hearing what they say and what they want. But like you said, the Russians would then put pressure on the West to reduce arms shipments, in good faith for peace talks. But it's all a trick. None of it's sincere.
Well, you have heard what they're saying. When recently the Russians did tell the United States that they would like US recognition of these annexed territories as a precondition for talks. So the message is loud and clear, which is, as you say, fanciful, which to me suggests that they're not particularly serious about getting a deal, because they haven't even got, I don't believe they've even got Iran to recognize these annexations. I'd have to check that. But to ask the United States to recognize them, or the Ukrainians to recognize them as part of talks, suggests that there's still a vast gap between the two sides.
I know the Syrians recognize them, so
yes.
So Russia got Syria. Have we entered a new Cold War era between Russia and the West? The point that we've gotten to, commercial airlines can't fly over each other's airspaces. I just think about how deep we've come. How do we dig ourselves out with all of these sanctions being placed on Russia and all the preconditions that would have to be met before normal economic and diplomatic relations could be resumed? What's your take on how the world is changing and reverting back to the pre-1991 era?
Well, it's interesting, because I don't think even during the Cold War the Soviet Union ever cut off hydrocarbon exports to Europe. So that's a step that has been taken this time around that wasn't taken last time. So in some ways, there are features of this current clash that were not present during the Cold War. Obviously, NATO now recognizes Russia explicitly as a security challenge. So that went into the strategic concept, which was a new thing, to explicitly recognize Russia as a threat. But I think I'd say from a historical perspective is all wars end. All wars end. All animosity is temporary. It may take a very long time, but depending on what the final settlement is with the passage of time, it's certainly possible to rebuild connections with Russia. I mean, in many ways, the Germans and the Japanese were vicious enemies of the United States throughout the Second World War. They're now some of the closest allies of the United States. It is possible to rebuild bridges between nations. So I'm optimistic that with the passage of time, it's possible. But I think anyone who expects Russia to collapse tomorrow from economic pressure is probably deluding themselves, because industrial nations have a lot of staying power, far more staying power than we ever assume. So it's unlikely this state of affairs, I'm saying, could persist in an economic sense for some time without there being a dramatic collapse and thus a rapprochement.
Since you're an Australian, I want to get your perspective. What is the perceptions from Australians on this war between Ukraine and Russia? Russia is not a security threat to Australia. Australia is not a member of NATO. Why should Australians care about this conflict in Europe?
Well, I'm only one Australian, so I won't claim to speak for everyone, and I'm certainly not in Parliament. But look, I love polling data because it's more objective than individual opinion. I'll offer an individual opinion later. Just in terms of how Australians feel about it, I think it was something like 70% think Russia is a threat to us. Our interests, not to us, but to our interests in terms of a global international order that follows certain rules. 90% of the population said they were happy to take Ukrainian refugees. I think a majority, it's about 65%, said they were willing to impose more sanctions, even if it dramatically increased the cost of living. I think that came out of the Lowy polls. And interestingly, we're one of those countries where there's very little difference in the polls between people who want to send heavy weapons and people who are happy to send light weapons. We don't really make that differentiation. It seems to be Australians are of the view that if there's a war on, like you send weapons. There's no real difference between a tank and an assault rifle. So we don't have much to send, but the support for sending it is certainly there. And in many ways, the public opinion on this has held up pretty well over time and across different polls, in that it's generally 2/3 to 3/4 majority in favour of pretty heavy support of Ukraine. I wouldn't take that to mean that, Rob the Brickie does not wake up every morning, open his paper, and think about what he's going to do to throw the Russians out of Ukraine every morning. Like, it's not the dominating thing in the national consciousness. But statistically speaking, Rob probably thinks that Vladimir Putin's a bit of a dickhead, probably thinks that invading other nations is a shit thing to do, and probably thinks that you should help out people who are being pushed around. In the YouTube space, I think can get sidetracked because the people who are engaging with this sort of content, who are commenting, are going to be the most politically engaged in a particular issue. But if you talk about where the body politic as a whole sits, I think it is slightly less engaged, but still generally supportive. If I was to opine on what people or what's behind that, I think one thing I would say is Australians don't like a bully. I think a lot of Australians, like I said, from that part of the world, remember their independence efforts in the 1990s. And I think as a smaller country, you might observe sometimes there is a view that smaller countries are more vulnerable. I don't think any American genuinely believes that there is ever a threat that someone else is going to roll in, invade the United States, and take away their independence. Like, it's not a genuine threat. You are the military superpower. You spent years of your life sitting in an underground bunker to make sure that absolutely no one even thought about that idea. But there's a little bit of sympathy with, from one middle power to another, saying that, yeah, a major military power can come around and try and turn your life upside down. And, maybe something should be done about it. That's just what the qualitative stuff out of the polling is saying. That's not so much me. That's just what I've been able to read.
You and I have both interviewed a common guest, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. I enjoyed your interview with him and your questions. So at this point in the podcast, I want to ask you, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask me?
Yeah, I do. And one of them is just to wedge you for the future, which is that you were a 13 November during your time in the USAF. So if I ever do a video on LGM 35, I hope you'll agree to come in and talk about it.
Yeah. I mean,
and the replacement program for the Minutemen.
There's a lot that I can talk about it. For anyone watching this who doesn't know my background, I was in charge of the maintenance, security, and operations of the Minuteman III Intercontinental Ballistic Missile System. And I was stationed at Minot Air Force Base. Here's a fun fact for you. It's the most powerful military base in the world by destructive firepower. Between the ICBM wing and the B-52 wing, more firepower there than anywhere else in the world.
And this segues really well into my other question, which is that, and this is because I talk to a number of Ukrainians, I'm sure you do too, and the question both the Ukrainians and even the Russians I've talked to keep asking is, can Ukraine rely on the Americans and their Western allies. I have a view on this. I'm sure you have a view on this, but Russian strategy seems to be, it may not be, but it seems to be about war extension. Make America tired. And I'll go further. I'll say if the Russians believed that America would go as far as it possibly could, then they might have either given up or escalated months ago. Because at that stage, there is no, from a military-industrial perspective, from the perspective I come at a conflict from, if the Western allies decide to outlast Russia by supplying Ukraine, there is no contest. They can do it. They can solve the ammo problem. They can solve the GBAD problem. They can keep the weapons flowing. They can get Ukraine into a position where they achieve whatever military objective they want short of nuclear war. So for a country like Ukraine, who's giving it their all, they know they can win, but whether they will ultimately depends on whether or not the supplies keep flowing. So I guess my question to you as an American would be, from your individual position, America occupies a very privileged position. Whether you guys want to or not, you are one of the protagonists of the international order just because of the resources you have available to you. Do you think Americans see that their national interest is tied up in Ukraine? Does the average American know what the Budapest Memorandum was? And do you think American support's likely to be enduring?
I think as far as domestic news, Russia invading Ukraine was pretty big in March and April. I think with 24-hour cable news, it was just covering humanitarian crisis with all the refugees, story after story to keep people engaged. But around the summertime, I think with domestic news, it kind of dropped off. There are lots of people who watch your channel and watch my channel that say they're on YouTube to get information about the war because they can't get it on the nightly news unless something really big has happened. But I think domestic politics in the United States with the midterm elections took over, and it's still running. And yes, the Republicans took control of the House, but I made a dedicated video talking about this. And what I think is going to happen is before the Republicans take control of the House on January 3rd or January 4th, they're going to pass another funding bill for Ukraine to fund it for all of 2023. This is probably going to be like $40 billion. And that they're going to pass that between Christmas and New Year's probably. I think a deal has already been struck. They just, the way Congress works, they always just wait till the last possible minute to do anything. And as far as President Joe Biden and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, they're all in on making sure that Russia does not win. This is the stated strategic objective of the United States. Russia cannot win. So the Lend-Lease Act is still in effect through, I think, August or October of next year. I think they're going to have funding for all of next year. So if Ukraine can get this done in 2023, I think they're solid. But if I'm being honest with my channel, if we get into 2024, I think if there's no progress being made on the ground, if it's just trench warfare, gridlocked, nothing is being done, then yeah, I think the average American at that point in 2024 might lose interest. But for the next 12 months, I think the support will remain solid.
It is an interesting point that you can be a country giving it your all, half of your economy going towards the war effort, millions of your people either under arms or supporting the war effort. And at the end of the day, to a great extent, the future of your country ultimately rests on decisions made in a foreign capital. That's the quandary of being a smaller power.
I think politically, Russia and Putin have been doing all the wrong things. They've been antagonizing the United States for the last 4 or 5 years. If they just didn't interfere in our elections, and like I said, I don't understand their politics or their rationale, why they've been doing what they've been doing, but there is a solid bipartisan support between Republicans and Democrats in America to just make sure Russia loses. I mean, it's more anti-Russia than pro-Ukraine. I'm very pro-Ukraine, but there's a lot of people, given everything that Russia and Putin has done, especially the last 4 or 5 years, they're not going to be allowed to win.
Interesting. Anyway, that was all from me. Thank you for indulging the curiosity.
Well, thank you for your time and your expertise and your weekly hour-long PowerPoint presentations. I know people all over the world thoroughly enjoy them. You were the number one requested podcast guest. So once this goes up, I know a lot of people are going to be excited to see our interaction. I think that's all the time we have for today. Perun, do you have any final thoughts or final things you want to say?
No, just tremendous thanks for having me on board. I very much appreciate it. And thanks too to the audience for those who remain engaged in this. It is, as we say, history being written in real time. And it's great that people continue to engage in it, pay attention to it, and sometimes even help with it.
Very well said. Everyone still watching, thank you for your time. Thank you for your support to Ukraine. Until the next podcast, take care.